Hello and welcome to the online exchange session with SIGAR, Recovering Ukraine Experience and Lessons of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. My name is Evgenia Hrysko, and I represent the Ukrainian independent think tank, the Institute of Analysis and Advocacy. I am pleased to welcome you to this event that we are hosting. Our research as a think tank focuses on issues related to Ukrainian institutional recovery, European integration, digitalization, and public finance. Before we commence, there are a few technical details to note. The working language of this session is English. We have also simultaneous translation into Ukrainian available. Please select your preferred audio channel in the settings. In the event of an air alert, we kindly request all participants and listeners to prioritize their safety. We just hope that today will be a much calmer day than yesterday. And following the presentations, we will dedicate enough time to a Q&A session. Please submit your questions in the designated Q&A box in the menu. This online session is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube and on the Facebook page of our institute. Today's meeting is supported by Transparency International Ukraine, the BHP Foundation, and is part of PACT's activity under US Engage program, which is funded by USAID and implemented by PACT. And before we begin, I would like to pass the floor to Valeria Ovcharova, who represents USAID Engage. She is the Recovery and Reconstruction Program Officer. Valeria, please. Maybe I don't see if Valeria has joined. Maybe she will join us later. Then I'm happy to pass the floor to the Executive Director of the Institute of Analytics and Advocacy, Yuri Romashko.
Thank you, Evgenia. I hope you hear me well. I apologize, colleagues, for my voice. I'm currently on a sick leave, so I will keep my speech quite brief. First of all, I can only imagine how busy your schedule because of the end of the year. So I want to express my gratitude to our today's speakers from SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And also I want to express my sincere thanks to Valeria Ivanova, Deputy Head of the State Agency for Restoration, because of the same, despite the year and a huge framework of tasks. Thank you so much that you found time to join us. Any experience is valuable. We recognize that experience of SIGAR are extremely important because of a huge framework of tasks. We look forward to hearing insightful information and lessons learned, what solutions and what approaches worked well, and at the same time, what solutions and approaches didn't work well, what we should avoid. We understand that there is no experience in any of countries which we can simply just copy it and edit it. It doesn't work in that way because of very different situations, very different context factors. Ukraine and the war causes conditions of extremely high level of uncertainty. But despite this, Ukraine is rebuilding with the principle here and now, which is very, very correct and very needed. So the simpler thing we can do is to identify the best approaches and the worstest approaches, how to especially avoid them. Therefore, I thank you so much for all of you colleagues, and I wish a productive next 1.5 hours of work. And now I pass the floor to Evgenia. Thank you.
Yuri, thanks very much. And Valeria from USAID Engage has joined us. Valeria, please.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the technical issues. First of all, I want to say thank you to the whole team of the Institute of Analytics and Advocacy for organizing such an important event. And of course, I would like to express my gratitude to the all invited organizations for their readiness to exchange their experiences, and at Engage, we believe that such discussions and such exchanges led us to build the process of recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine based on the lessons learned from their very different experiences. And we also believe that through this learning, Ukrainian civil society organizations can improve the process of recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine. And thank you again, dear participants, organizers, and speakers, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Valeria, thank you very much. We can actually commence with with the main topic of our event today. A small intro, and then I'm very happy to pass the floor to David and Chris.
Wonderful.
Since 2002, the US allocated for reconstruction and relief in Afghanistan approximately $150 billion. Later, the US Congress created SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, as an independent agency focused solely on the Afghanistan mission and its reconstruction issues. SIGAR was in a unique position. It had jurisdiction over all programs and operations, regardless of the agency involved. And today is actually in the position to identify and share lessons of the past 2 decades of the US reconstruction effort in Afghanistan. And we could not take the chance to talk to them, and we are extremely grateful to David Young, the team lead of Lessons Learned program, and Chris Bergeson, Deputy Assistant Inspector General, who joined us today and are eager to share with us the lessons learned of SIGAR in Afghanistan. Thank you very much, and feel free to tell us everything that is not classified.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the invitation, and you already hit some of the main points that I am going to highlight. As you said, I'm Chris Borgeson, the Deputy Inspector General for Audits and Inspections, meaning that I oversee all audits, evaluations, and inspections that we do. I'm going to provide you a very brief high-level overview of the reconstruction of Afghanistan, how and why SIGAR was founded, how we coordinate our oversight efforts, what made SIGAR special, or what put the special in SIGAR, provide an overview of our organizational structure, and then lastly, provide a short overview of the key oversight mechanisms that made SIGAR especially effective. If we can go to the next slide. This slide right here provides a high-level overview of the U.S. reconstruction architecture. More than 10 U.S. agencies provided different forms of reconstruction aid to Afghanistan. So it really was a whole-of-government effort. The largest were the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, all organizations that are also involved in providing assistance to the Ukraine. The next two bullets are pretty important. Most of the civilian agencies operated out of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. That's where they were headquartered and did most of their coordination, while DoD operated out of coalition military bases. One of our findings that we found over and over again was that we often found that U.S. assistance had not been properly coordinated and had sometimes worked at cross purposes. Some of that is probably due to the fact that the missions were not fully aligned and working side by side in the same location. Next slide, please. This provides a little bit about what made SIGAR different, and this was our oversight role and jurisdiction. Firstly, SIGAR reports directly to Congress, our legislative branch. It allows us to truly produce independent research and analysis because we don't have to filter what we do or say through anybody else. We can just tell it directly to our legislative branch. We are the only agency with a mandate to review all U.S. government reconstruction spending for Afghanistan, meaning other organizations can look at their own spending, but we can look at everyone's spending. This is important because we were created as a whole. No one else could look at whole of government reconstruction issues. We often found reconstruction issues in the gaps between separate U.S. agency programs. Again, if programs and efforts weren't properly coordinated, sometimes either key tasks or key drivers of success or failure fell between the gaps where nobody necessarily was looking. We were actually modeled after the Special Inspector General for the Iraq Reconstruction, which was created a few years before us. They had a whole of government mandate to look at the U.S. efforts in Iraq. And then lastly, we operated out of both the U.S. Embassy and out of coalition military bases. And being co-located on both sites really allowed us to see more of what was going on and really be able to get our boots on the ground, so to speak, to find the ground truth. Next slide, please. Obviously, every oversight effort needs to be well coordinated. This slide briefly describes the multiple levels of coordination that we did to ensure that our work was both fulsome and did not duplicate anybody else's. First, we participated in quarterly and annual cross-agency coordination working groups to plan and deconflict our oversight. These were high-level meetings where every organization would provide their annual oversight plan to each other and talk through what oversight each person was going to do. This is important because of that third bullet on the page. Reviewing other organizations' annual plans helps to deconflict work, but it also identifies potential gaps in programming. If everybody's in their own silo and only looking at the work that they're doing and not looking at the work anybody else is doing, not only can you do the same work as somebody else, which is bad, what's even worse is there might be gaps in oversight. There might be programs nobody's looking at, and it's important to be able to identify those. Lastly, before each and every engagement, whether it was a lessons learned report or an audit or an inspection or an evaluation, we would notify the participating agencies, so the agencies performing the program, as well as their oversight organizations of our work prior to beginning, to give them one last chance to deconflict any work. Next slide, please. One thing that put the special in SIGAR, it was how we applied our expertise. First, we had longer tours of duty in country than most any other organization. We'd have folks who would stay in Afghanistan from 3 to 5 years or even longer, when a lot of organizations were working on 6-month or 9-month tours. These longer tours of duty and years of cumulative experience meant that we became a storehouse for knowledge about past reconstruction efforts. We were often able to say, this was tried 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, and nobody else remembered that it had been tried, and be able to provide some tips to hopefully make the program more effective. This also meant that we developed lasting professional relationships with U.S. and international reconstruction officials. It allowed us to tell them hard truths. Because they'd worked with us for years and they knew us, they knew the quality of our work, we were able to tell them the hard truths that nobody necessarily wanted to hear about the efficacy of their programs. And then lastly, our internal fact-checking procedures, along with our strict adherence to professional standards, meant that our reports have stood the test of time against criticism. Obviously, when you're telling hard truths to folks, and when you're telling somebody that millions or billions of dollars of money aren't being used properly or are going to waste, or the program's not being effective, there are lots of vested interests who are going to try to criticize your report and knock it down and attack the legitimacy of it. Our internal fact-checking procedures, as well as our strict adherence to professional standards, means that our report stood against that criticism because we were telling the truth. Next slide, please. This slide provides a high-level overview of our organizational structure. We have 10 separate directorates of varying sizes that all work together to accomplish our mission. Front office is our executive leadership. Audits and evaluations performs audits and evaluations like it sounds. Research, the rest of these are relatively straightforward. Obviously, research and analysis puts out our quarterly report and does in-depth research. David's office at the Lessons Learned program produced long-term reports. It really spanned multiple years and provided in-depth analysis. And then quality control made sure all of our facts were right. And then general counsel, congressional affairs, public affairs, all work together to get our reports out and make sure that we're operating within the law. And then investigations was our criminal wing. So they would go out and do criminal investigations. And lastly, management and support provided all of the necessary management and support, HR, backbone, IT resources that we needed to operate. Next slide, please. This slide highlights the 3 key oversight mechanisms that really help SIGAR make an impact. First is our statutory authority. SIGAR has the legal right to access all materials related to the reconstruction of Afghanistan. This means no program is off limit, no document is off limit. We all have security clearances and we can all go in and look at the material that we need to go. Nobody can slam the door in our face and say that we're not allowed to look at it. This goes hand in hand with our ability to testify in front of Congress. Again, that goes back to speaking truth to power and being able to tell our legislative branch exactly what we found without any intermediaries. Our audit and evaluation tools, how we actually perform our work. We have a whole toolkit, obviously site visits, seeing for ourselves what was going on, interviews, talking to folks who are actually implementing the programs, document reviews, looking at the program documents as well as any other studies about them, surveys. We do lots of surveys of folks in Afghanistan or of beneficiaries to find out their impressions and really determine how the assistance is benefiting or could be improved. Data triangulation and analysis. You hear something once, it might be true. You hear something twice, it's getting a little bit more likely. But if you hear something 3 or 4 times from 5 or 6 different sources, written interviews, you saw it on the ground, then you know it to be true. So data triangulation is very important to really make sure that what you're hearing and what you're seeing is the actual truth and in the proper context. And then lastly, third-party monitoring. There were some sites we couldn't go because of security or other issues, and being able to have trusted partners who can go there in your stead is very important. These tools helped us to build publicly released reports and recommendations and really help them stand the test of time against folks who would try to criticize them. And then lastly, we had our investigatory tools. These are the tools that our investigators use to build criminal cases and put people in jail for fraud. So they used interviews. We do have subpoena power, so they could subpoena documents and things like that. And then the hotline, which allowed anybody to put in a tip, either via email or a phone call. They could do it either with their name attached or anonymously. So that was very useful. So that way, if somebody saw something going wrong, they were able to call and let us know, and then we were able to take it from there and investigate. That covers my portion of this presentation. Thank you all very much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David Young.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you to Yevgenia and Yuri and IA for hosting. It's great for us to be here with you all. I'll talk a bit about some challenges that SIGAR faces and some challenges that SIGAR faces, and then go into a few lessons for reconstruction for the recovery of Ukraine that may be relevant. So to start with a few procedural challenges that we face. To analyze U.S. reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan, we can and do request information from agencies, from U.S. agencies, and this is usually in the form of documents. And then we use them to analyze U.S. strategies and programs. Excuse me. Now, sometimes it takes a long time to get those responses, and this can slow us down. And we're also required to send agencies draft reports so that they can review them before publication. This is a requirement that we have that allows them to write up a formal response for our audits and evaluations, which are then attached to the end of those reports when they're published. And this way, our readers know what agencies think of our work and have a chance to defend themselves. For the lessons learned reports, like the kind that my team and I write, we work closely with agencies to actually incorporate their feedback and about arguments and evidence that we use. So this ensures that our reports actually account for their concerns rather than simply give them a chance to respond to them. And sometimes, as you can imagine, these conversations can be a bit contentious, and it takes time to work out disagreements. But it's an important part of the process. There are also legal constraints. Sometimes we will ask for information so that we can use it in our public reports, and agencies might tell us that it's classified, which means we can get access to the information through classified channels, but we obviously can't publish that information. As an example, at one point, the U.S. Department of Defense stopped sharing statistics about the number of casualties among Afghan security forces. And this statistic is very important to us because it has it reveals and has a significant impact on how well the Afghan forces were doing, and because the U.S. spent billions of dollars supporting that force. And so we felt that that statistic was important for that story, but we were ultimately unable to publish it for years because that statistic, the monthly or weekly statistic, became classified. Other times, agencies question our jurisdiction, which can be a constraint, of course. Congress might ask us to do something, to write a report on a specific topic, and the agencies will claim that doing so falls outside our jurisdiction, and so they refuse to cooperate with us on that subject, or sometimes entirely. And so this creates obstacles and delays. Other times there are administrative challenges. After the Afghan government collapsed, we asked to visit a U.S. Air Force base in Arizona to see which Afghan aircraft had been transferred there, because ultimately we paid for and supplied these aircraft. And so it was a matter of accountability for where these aircraft were. And we were denied access to that base for nearly a year. And as Chris noted, we are also legally entitled to interview U.S. officials involved in U.S. reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan, but sometimes they will decline to be interviewed. They will delay interviews, deny us access to the officials who are best suited to be interviewed about that specific subject as well. And sometimes there are constraints because the material, like substantive constraints, because the material is too sensitive, even if it's not classified. My team wrote a lessons learned report on U.S. support to elections in Afghanistan several years ago, and it actually took 2 years to publish because the State Department kept requesting that we delay publication because they were worried that our findings would affect ongoing Afghan elections at that time. And we ultimately agreed because we felt that our recommendations would be more likely to be followed if our report didn't become sort of a political football in Afghanistan. So there are substantive issues, substantive constraints as well sometimes. Every oversight organization has to decide how aggressive and public they want to be. And our philosophy at SIGAR is that sunlight is the best disinfectant, meaning sharing and broadcasting our findings to the widest audience possible is the most likely method of encouraging reform in the government. And sometimes, as Chris noted, this makes us unpopular among government officials who sometimes can conclude that our real goal is just simply to embarrass them. And this obviously, or we hope obviously, is not the case. But we know it is not the case, but we're simply trying to create the structural motivations for reform. And by contrast, we found that that quietly sharing our findings with U.S. agencies doesn't actually motivate them to reform or improve how they spend taxpayer funds. So tensions over the last 15 years, sometimes tensions between our agency and the agencies we oversee can run quite high. And during those times, Congress has been our strongest advocate and has instructed U.S. agencies to cooperate with us on multiple occasions to try and reinvigorate that cooperative relationship and make sure that it matches the statutory requirements that we're endowed with. And so, excuse me, other times they will act as a bit more of a referee between us and the agencies we oversee, and that's fine too. So all of these constraints are real, but despite them all, what really makes us an effective oversight organization are 3 attributes, and Chris touched on a few of them. First is a legal mandate inscribed in the law for us to conduct independent oversight work. No one can legally claim that we don't have the right to do what we do. Second, we have an institutional arrangement so that we never feel pressured to cater to the interests of the offices we oversee. Even indirectly, we don't feel this pressure. It's an extraordinary luxury. And that's because we don't work for the agencies we oversee. We don't even work in the same building as them. We don't need them to like our conclusions. We hope that they would embrace them, certainly, because the reforms are theirs to implement. But for us, reporting directly to Congress has been critical for that institutional arrangement and chain of command. It sometimes, frankly, feels like we're not even part of the executive branch of the U.S. government, which, of course, we certainly are. It's just that it really speaks to how unattached in every meaningful way we are that ensures our success. And third, we have political support from policymakers who believe in our mission, who are willing to fight for it, and who will compel cooperation during times of tension. After all, institutions are just organizations made up of people, and effective oversight needs powerful advocates insisting on that independent oversight. We have also found that a critical piece of this puzzle goes far above the level of specific projects and programs, which is the bread and butter of most oversight organizations. In 2015, we started our Lessons Learned program, which is unique for oversight organizations in that our goal is to essentially zoom out and examine the strategies and assumptions and the theories of change in the massive undertakings that we pursued in Afghanistan. And you can see our reports here, each several hundred pages long with thousands of citations. And we have come to view these reports as critical to helping policymakers understand how we came to the decisions that we did, why reforms have been so difficult, and how to overcome those obstacles. And I'll give a couple of examples. First, our strategic outlook was always short-term. If you take a snapshot in time at any point during the 20 years, stakeholders at every level were always told we were about to leave and that they had to act accordingly. And you can imagine what this does to everyone involved. You know, a police advisor or an aid worker will seek out short-term solutions because the long-term doesn't exist. And for the people back at headquarters, why build personnel structures? Why invest in your own institutions to find highly qualified people if you think everything is about to stop? And that mentality, that short-term mentality, lasted 20 years. But it also wasn't just that we were bad at predicting the timeline for our withdrawal. There was immense pressure to make fast progress in the little time we always thought that we had left. And that time pressure led us to make a lot of mistakes. We spent money without being careful, and we often made problems worse, that the very problems we were hoping to address, we ended up often making worse. And so there were a few things we could have done differently that, just for perspective, we'd urge Ukrainian officials and civil society to consider. We had a tendency to think about our high-level objectives on the one hand and the level of resources on the other. But we didn't put enough effort into thinking about the theories of change and in step-by-step how our interventions would actually create the changes we wanted to see. We thought that we'd take our objectives, our goals, and we thought that if we just turned up the dial on resources, on troop levels, and on funding, program funding, Afghanistan would just be rebuilt. It would just happen. And without much evidence regarding what does and doesn't work, we implemented programs that were, frankly, more driven by hopes and aspirations. And so it's not surprising that many were ineffective. Second, we would encourage you to create teams in relevant ministries whose job it is to question assumptions and strategies and approaches, though of their colleagues working alongside them in their ministries. We call this a red team, and intelligence agencies and companies use them to make sure that a big effort that is being done by their peers and colleagues is done thoughtfully and appropriately. And SIGAR, for perspective, is basically a big red team for the rest of the US government. And if these red teams have the independence and encouragement from ministers and their senior staff to do good work, the strategies and programs are often stripped of their weaknesses and are significantly strengthened because they are essentially stress tested by independent observers within these organizations. Lastly, the donors you're working with are, as you know, currently facing a lot of uncertainty about future funding levels for Ukraine. And this might create a perfect storm for aggressive timelines. If they, for instance, can only predict 6 months into the future based on funding levels, they may want to see a lot of progress during those 6 months. If so, they're likely to say or imply to their Ukrainian partners and government counterparts that getting more funds in the future may depend on you all showing progress in the immediate future. But rebuilding infrastructure, as we have seen in Afghanistan, and rebuilding institutions is a long-term endeavor, and doing it quickly, trying to do it quickly, creates many long-term problems. For perspective, we hollowed out Afghan government institutions with our one-year plans. It wasn't Afghan one-year plans, it was our one-year plans. And just as an example, there was significant pressure to reduce insurgent attacks, right, as you can imagine, in Afghanistan. And this compelled US officials to make compromises on the vetting and training of Afghan security forces. So trainees who were not qualified in the first place and not ready to fight the Taliban were deployed across the country. And many ended up just preying on Afghan civilians instead of protecting them. And so if you face pressure to make compromises that hurt the long-term viability of your institutions, we would encourage you to push back as best you can. You can cite evidence like ours to demonstrate that if you go too fast, the wheels might come off the car. Also, we had a tendency to think of corruption like a nuisance, certainly in the first decade of the war, to think of corruption as a nuisance that created waste and that it was often just the cost of doing business. It's something, corruption was viewed as something that it could be, if it got too bad, it could be sort of shaved off and removed with a scalpel, right? But the US spent way too much money, way too fast, and in a country that really couldn't absorb it, and it generated a great deal of corruption. And corruption itself became a sensitive topic because it was thought to undermine support for the government. And so few people wanted to discuss it, few officials wanted to discuss it. And in that, as a result, the government's perceived strength was more important than its actual strength, or became more important than its actual strength. And it took the US government, just for perspective, 8 years to conclude that corruption was a strategic threat to the mission, was a strategic threat to the country's viability. In fact, it became seen far too late as an even greater threat than the Taliban, than the insurgency. So in the early years of the war, we missed a brief opportunity to address corruption before it turned the government into a large organized crime syndicate, just speaking about Afghanistan. And by the time we recognized the threat, it was too late. So there were times where we tried to address corruption by conditioning assistance. This is just simply from the donor's perspective. We'd say to Afghan officials, if you don't implement these reforms, we'll withhold 20% of the funds that we promised you. But Afghan officials would call our bluff. It was more important to us to have a stable government than it was to have a government with integrity. And so when these reforms were not met, we didn't follow through on our threats to withhold the assistance that we had said we would. We were essentially too scared of what would happen if we followed through on these threats. Now, we are not experts on Ukraine. We're here to provide perspective, and we hope it's helpful. But the amount of assistance coming to Ukraine is extraordinary, even by comparison to Afghanistan. These are just facts. And it's still early in Ukraine. And so donors, Ukrainian officials, and Ukrainian civil society are in actually a very good position to take the threat of corruption seriously, as many of you may be, as we presume certainly are, and that you would be rewarded for doing so in terms of the impact of assistance early on during this mission. Corruption likely remains a significant problem, but talking about it makes donors nervous, just as it did in Afghanistan. And I'm sure it makes many Ukrainians involved in the recovery quite nervous as well. But the key lesson from Afghanistan is that declining to make corruption among the highest priorities, reducing corruption among the highest priorities, is an enormous risk that could jeopardize Ukraine's future, even if everything else goes extremely well. Even if Russian troops were to withdraw, corruption remains, as it did in Afghanistan throughout the entire mission, a strategic threat to what to its recovery. So I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Evgenia. Thank you.
Chris, David, thank you very much. I think all of us are now processes everything that you both said. Now I am very honored to pass the floor to Valeria Ivanova. She is the Deputy Head of the State Agency for Restoration and Development of Infrastructure of Ukraine. And she will kindly share with us the instruments of oversight and control that Ukraine has and that the agency is using. Valeria, please, the floor is yours. David and Chris, probably you will have to turn on the interpretation or you will have a Ukraine language lesson right now.
Доброго дня, колеги. Дуже дякую за вашу презентацію і думаю, що стане обов'язково для нас дуже корисним у зв'язку з тим, що у нас більшість нашого відновлення воно попереду, і ми тільки зараз формуємо спеціальне законодавство про відновлення. Хотілося б почати з того, що я розкажу, чим займається Агентство відновлення і які з чого воно було створено, які у нас є, власне, методи контролю. Розпочнемо з того, що російська агресія зруйнувала по попереднім оцінкам вже більше, ніж 245 тисяч об'єктів інфраструктури. Туди входять і соціальні об'єкти, приватні будинки, енергетичні об'єкти, об'єкти транспорту, все те, що нашій країні попереду доведеться відновлювати. Тепер з цих 245 тисяч об'єктів вже 70 тисяч внесені до реєстру, електронного реєстру пошкодженого майна. Вони пройшли попередню оцінку вартості пошкодження, а також ступеню руйнувань. Частину з них повністю знищено, частину з них зазнало значних руйнувань. У зв'язку з цим було створено Агентство відновлення. Це центральний орган виконавчої влади, який містить 24 служби відновлення в регіонах. У нас є області. В областях кожній з областей створена відповідна служба, яка займається відновленням в регіонах. Окрім відновлення, окрім нашого агентства, відновленням займаються також і органи місцевого самоврядування, так звані муніципалітети, об'єднані територіальні громади, які зараз займаються безпосередньо відновленням на місцях. Тобто ми не єдиний орган, який займається відновленням інфраструктури. Агентство було створено на базі Укравтодору. Це колишнє державне агентство, яке займалося утриманням доріг та будівництвом доріг, а також капітальним ремонтом національної мережі українських доріг. Таке рішення було прийнято у зв'язку з тим, що в колишньому Укравтодорі, а тепер вже агентстві відновлення, було достатня спроможність кадрова для того, щоб робити такі великі об'єкти. Наразі Агентство відновлення займається відновленням соціальної інфраструктури, приватних будинків, комплексним відновленням населених пунктів, також з великих національних проєктів – це захист критичної інфраструктури. У зв'язку з тим, що російська агресія продовжується, ми захищаємо нашу енергетичну інфраструктуру і відновлюємо критичні об'єкти, такі як водогони. Я думаю, що колеги знають, що в нас була пошкоджена гідроелектростанція. Зараз агентство реалізує об'єкт з поновленням водопостачання в Дніпропетровській області для того, щоб у людей була питна вода. Також займаються відновленням мостів. Зараз агентство реалізує понад 50 мостів, які були пошкоджені внаслідок російської агресії при деокупації чи окупації наших регіонів. Незважаючи на російську агресію, у України є великі амбітні плани щодо пришвидшення відновлення, і у нас є особлива історія в тому, що наш державний апарат, він не перестав функціонувати. У нас працюють і правоохоронні органи, які були створені спеціально для запобігання корупції. Це і Національне агентство з запобігання корупції, це превентивний орган, який регулюється спеціальним законом про запобігання корупції і містить певні норми, які зобов'язують всіх державних службовців подавати відкриті декларації, уникати конфлікту інтересів і вводить певні статті Кримінального кодексу, які зобов'язують чиновників, зокрема і ті, які працюють над відновленням, дотримуватись певних стандартів. Перед тим, як я стала заступником голови Агентства відновлення, працювала в Національному агентстві з запобігання корупції саме в цьому органі. Також у нас створений спеціальний орган Національне антикорупційне бюро, це правоохоронний орган, який займається антикорупційними розслідуваннями. Також у нас є Державна аудиторська служба і Рахункова палата, це при Верховній Раді України орган, який допомагає з врахуванням бюджетних коштів і їх витрачання по певним програмам фінансування. Фонди, які створені спеціально для ліквідації наслідків російської агресії, це, зокрема, і фонд ліквідації наслідків, які поповнюються з вилучених Російської Федерації активів, а також від Національного банку України. Тобто, попри повномасштабну російську агресію, наші органи продовжують і інститут продовжують працювати. У нас є спеціальний суд, Вищий антикорупційний суд і спеціалізована антикорупційна прокуратура. Ще до повномасштабного вторгнення, попри те, що війна тривала і попередні 7 років, була створена спеціальна гілка влади від прокуратури до спеціального органу, який займається виключно великими антикорупційними справами. І також суд спеціальний, який розглядає корупцію на вищому рівні. Це те, що стосується там державного апарату і функціонування державного апарату. Також в країні створений інститут антикорупційних уповноважених. В кожному державному органі влади існують антикорупційні уповноваження, які слідкують за тим, щоб закон про запобігання корупції він був застосований і не порушувався на місцях. Це те, що стосується зовнішнього інституційної спроможності держави контролювати ці процеси. А також є те, що Агентство відновлення робить фактично зараз, і те, як воно всередині своєї структури вибудовує там ефективні процеси аудиту, внутрішнього контролю і антикорупційні механізми. В Агентстві відновлення розроблена, ми існуємо вже 9 місяців, 8 місяців, розробили антикорупційну програму, в якій ввійшло пріоритетом 38 корупційних ризиків, які ми ідентифікували для себе і над якими попередньо і пріоритизовано які будемо мінімізувати. Зараз створена для залучення громадськості до процесів відновлення і контролю за процесом використання державних коштів. При агентстві створена Рада прозорості і підзвітності. Туди входять найбільші організації громадські організації з антикорупції для того, щоб громадськість мала рівний доступ до будь-яких документів, які існують в Агентстві відновлення, які продукує Агентство відновлення, для того, щоб громадськість долучалася до процесів мінімізації ризиків. Антикорупційна програма була затверджена як в центральному офісі, так і в кожному з 22 регіонів, регіональних служб відновлення. Туди ввійшли понад 200 заходів з мінімізації ризиків. Також був прийнятий кодекс етики і доброчесності службовців, які працюють в Агентстві відновлення, і створені пришвидшене створення IT-інструментів, які дозволять таким складним об'єктам відновлення реалізуватись прозоро. Зокрема, був розроблений порядок по моніторингу вартості будівельних матеріалів, які використовуються при будівництві. Також розроблений регламент по затвердженню проєктно-кошторисної документації, яка готується на об'єктах відновлення. І ми дуже багато залучаємо донорів для того, щоб вони допомагали нам перевіряти проекти, створювати додатково, проходити технічний аудит проектної документації, в рамках якої потім з'явиться і реалізуються об'єкти будівництва. Зокрема, частина з цих ризиків, вона пов'язана із безпосереднім реалізацією будівництва і підготовкою планів. Тому на великі національні проекти залучено, зокрема, USAID, для того, щоб перевіряти додатково наші проекти і їх команди тут в Україні, для того, щоб працювати над тим, щоб проводити реформу публічних закупівель і проводити додаткові перевірки проєктів. Щодо реформи публічних закупівель, зараз в агентстві створена методика, яка забезпечує, і ми будемо намагатися робити так, щоб весь бізнес мав рівний доступ до торгів з відновлення. Всі торги, яке робить агентство відновлення, реалізуються виключно через електронний майданчик закупівель з усіма доступними пакетами документів для будь-якого бізнесу, який хоче прийняти участь у відновленні. Додатково створені команди, які перевіряють вартість проєктів для того, щоб вона не була завищена. До прикладу, на великий проєкт по водогонам була залучений технічний аудит проєктної документації від компанії USAID, яка перевіряла, чи справді проєкт реалізується за потрібних обсягів, за потрібною процедурою, і чи не завищена вартість відповідного будівництва. Разом з Базельським інститутом швейцарським і програмою ЄБРР була створена також верхньорівневий, затверджений Кабінетом міністрів, план ACAP, Це антикорупційний план, який включає необхідні заходи для того, щоб отримати додаткове фінансування від ЄБРР. У нас є ціла низка вимог, які агентство має пройти для того, щоб додатково залучити фінансування. Також з нами співпрацює UNODC. Вони надали нам експертів, які перевіряють тендерні документації, для того, щоб вони не містили форм фаворитизму і дискримінаційних критеріїв, а також напрацювали успішні практики публічних закупівель. Крім того, повертаючись на попередній слайд, у нас є амбітні плани щодо побудови IT-інструментів. Найближчий план наш – це побудувати електронний інструмент договірної роботи, де будуть збиратися вся первинна документація і обліковуватись, і йти через IT-інструменти є казначейство. Тобто всі оплати, які будуть здійснені підрядним організаціям за виконання тієї чи іншої роботи, вони будуть йти виключно через IT-інструмент з усіма даними, які будуть доступні як донорам, так і громадськості. Зараз цей IT-інструмент там готується. Окрім того, разом з міністерством робиться зараз система DREAM. Можливо, ви про неї чули. Це ті інструмент, куди збираються всі об'єкти відновлення і вся належна документація щодо реалізації таких об'єктів. Навіть туди будуть в майбутньому розроблені додаткові інструменти, які дозволять бачити і процедури аудиту, і процедури незалежного технічного нагляду при реалізації об'єктів, і вся необхідна інформація по пріоритизації. Важливим також в цьому є це відбір проєктів. Воно робиться спеціальною комісією. Ініціаторами є органи місцевого самоврядування, які самі визначають найбільш пріоритетні об'єкти для відновлення. Ці найбільш пріоритетні об'єкти потім потрапляють на спеціальну міжвідомчу комісію, яка складається з представників Міністерства освіти, Міністерства охорони здоров'я, різних органів місцевого самоврядування. Відповідно, на цій комісії вирішується, які об'єкти більш пріоритетно відновлювати. Система DREAM в результаті має стати разом з Світовим банком. Зараз міністерство напрацьовує спеціальну формулу пріоритетів, і на основі цієї формули потім будуть визначатися черговість проєктів по відновленню. Також у нас є внутрішня система аудиту в агентстві. Вона зараз додатково теж міжнародні партнери допомагають її посилювати. Перші 4 місяці роботи внутрішнього аудиту показали, що у нас є проблеми із ціноутворенням, з договірною роботою, і рекомендації, які вони винесли, зараз службами застосовуються для того, щоб мінімізувати ці ризики у майбутньому. Фактично, маємо надію, що система DREAM, а також система імплементації електронної договірної роботи і електронного збору первинної документації, вона допоможе, власне, виключити факт можливого неправомірного використання бюджетних коштів чи коштів донорів. Також на більшість проєктів по відновленню зараз залучений незалежний технічний нагляд для контролю за прихованими роботами, за якістю робіт, які виконуються на будівництвах. І також залучені на деякі проекти ризикові інженери-консультанти, це інженірингові компанії, які мають досвід в реалізації складних проєктів. Вони додатково перевіряють все те, що відбувається під час будівництва і під час підготовки проєктів. У нас є багато викликів. Частина з них пов'язана з тим, що країні важко будувати довгострокові плани. Ви теж зазначили, що це стало проблемою колись у вашій роботі. У нас є теж така проблема у зв'язку з тим, що фронт, він все ще дуже рухомий, і ризики, і щоденні атаки змушують постійно змінювати пріоритети. У зв'язку з тим, побудова довгострокових стабільних планів і стратегій, їх важко сформулювати і важко затвердити, бо фронт все ще дуже рухомий, а ракетні атаки, вони майже щоденні, тому це, власне, основний виклик для того, щоб побудувати можливі стратегічні плани для їх реалізації. Також проблема полягає у все ще потрібно розвивати антикорупційні інституції, частина з яких мають достатній вже досвід роботи над великими корупційними справами і успішно їх реалізовує. Водночас, звичайно, що країні ще попереду будувати і перероблювати судову реформу, яка є важливою і яка є вимогою до нас, як для країни, для отримання фінансування. І, звичайно, що посилення і реформування таких служб, як Служба безпеки України, яка наразі є одним з нереформованих органів. Попри це, багато з тих інструментів, які ми зараз використовуємо, є одними, насправді, з найкращих у світі. Це, зокрема, і електронна система Прозоро. Вона визнана як тендерний майданчик одним з найкращих. І у нас є зараз запуститься система DREAM, яка буде контролювати відновлення, і маємо надію, що всі ці IT-інструменти і додаткова допомога донорів за контролем і механізми, які вони виставляють для нас як вимогу перед отриманням коштів, стане для нас успішною реалізацією нашого відновлення, наших проєктів. Тому дякую. Якщо є якісь питання, буду дуже рада відповісти на них. І ще хочу зазначити, що я читала ваші звіти щодо попередньої роботи в Афганістані. І для нас цей досвід справді є корисним у зв'язку з тим, що окрім російської агресії, звичайно, що є виклик спроможних державних інституцій. У зв'язку з війною соціальний стан в країні, він значно погіршився, звичайно, що. І плюс через те, що часу дуже мало, і на деякі виклики треба реагувати дуже швидко. Це інколи загрожує демократичним процесом, бо раніше для того, щоб реалізувати якесь рішення, демократія має свою ціну, і вона завжди у тому, що мало часу. Тобто для демократії потрібно багато часу, і поки ти погодиш кожне рішення, на жаль, під час воєнного стану і під час повномасштабної війни ці терміни, вони значно звужуються, і потрібно дуже швидко реагувати. Але я маю надію, що це не вплине суттєво і після завершення воєнного стану, і під час війни ми зможемо все-таки зберегти наші корпоративні реформи, які робилися в країні, і процеси, прозорі процеси по відновленню, і прозорі процеси по розподіленню бюджетного фінансування. Дякую.
Валерія, вам величезне дякую за приділений час та надзвичайно важливу інформацію. Thank you to our speakers. Well, our online session is designed to be actually a forum for exchanging questions, opinions, comments. And before we continue with questions from the audience, maybe there are questions that Valeria, you have to SIGAR or SIGAR representatives have to you.
Так, у мене є питання. Ми дуже багато обговорювали про те, яким чином ми маємо готуватися до масштабного відновлення, тому що зараз тільки початок. І ми бачили плани казначейства, зокрема Сполучених Штатів, щодо вимог до України, які вона ставить в реформуванні. І ми побачили там такий захід щодо інспекторів з відновлення, які мають бути присутні, вона не дуже поки сформульована як задача, да? Інспекторів з відновлення, які мають бути присутні в центральних органів виконавчої влади. Я би хотіла про це проговорити, тому що для нас, у нас трохи відмінна, не трохи, значно відмінна, поки, дякую, ситуація, ніж в Афганістані. У нас працюючі інституції, і вони доволі, в деяких сферах доволі потужні. І хотілося б зрозуміти оцю форму взаємодії інспекторів з відновлення з державними органами влади. Бо у нас є інститут антикорупційних уповноважених, які працюють не тільки над відновленням як процесами, а взагалі над роботою і контролем за роботою органів влади. І хотілося б проговорити про їх роль або те, як бачите це ви. Тому що у нас при міністерствах, і це була велика програма, здається, зі Світовим банком, це починалося створені RST, це групи, які допомагають при реформуванні окремими міністерствами і центральним органом виконавчої влади. У нас таки є і при агентстві, це Capacity Building Office, CBO, в які входять експерти і допомагають по певним напрямкам, зокрема і публічних закупівель, антикорупції, комунікації, стратегічних, напрацювання стратегічних планів. Вони також працюють. І от хотілося б почути вашу думку щодо цих інспекторів. Дякую.
Sound on, please.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you so much for that question. I'm not familiar with the exact specifics of the legislation requiring inspectors or oversight of the U.S. assistance to the Ukraine. But based off your question, I would say that there's two important roles. One, like you said, are the inspectors within each agency. That's very important to have somebody within each organization who knows the ins and outs of the organization and is able to see the details and gain access to a lot of the data that organization has. And that's one level. And the U.S. has a similar structure where we have every U.S. federal agency has their own inspector general who's tasked with oversight investigations within that particular organization. Separately, I think it's also important, like you said, to have an overarching inspector general, an overarching oversight body that has the ability to look across organizations. One thing that we've found repeatedly is that when everybody is focused on their own organization and their own work, you get siloed and you only look at what's directly in front of you. When you have an oversight organization that's tasked with oversight over multiple organizations, they have the ability to look across each effort, each reconstruction effort, and really identify issues and problems that may not be apparent within one group, but become apparent when you take a step back and you look at the whole of the oversight effort. One thing we've found repeatedly is that in the gaps between organizations, in the gap between what U.S. aid is doing and what state is doing, there are program issues there, be it the programs aren't coordinated and working at cross purposes or something else. For example, in one case, we found that the Department of Defense wanted to build a natural gas pipeline to transport natural gas 100 kilometers, and they were funding that. USAID at the same time was funding a project to build a power plant at the site of the natural gas well. And then they were going to build power transmission lines to move the electricity. Both projects were planning on using the exact same resource, the same natural gas, and because they weren't talking to each other, both projects were going ahead to the phase where they were spending money and starting to construct things, and nobody realized they were working at cross purposes. So I think it's very important to have both oversight within the organization, within each agency working, as well as an organization that has oversight across the organization so they can identify where projects aren't coordinated, where they're working at cross purposes, or where there are gaps in programming that could be better spent.
Thank you. Then the questions that we have received. You said the US spent too much money and too fast. How to balance between urgency and strategic planning?
I think one metric that we identified in Afghanistan as knowing where the appropriate ceiling is just generally absorptive capacity. So finding a line between the line that you're looking for is always going to be a challenge. But I think one metric for keeping it in a manageable area is absorptive capacity. So experts have described, anti-corruption experts have described a range where certainly anywhere above 30 to 40% of GDP assistance should not exceed that level. right? And so obviously GDP for Ukraine is far higher than it is for Afghanistan. And so we're comparing a little bit apples to oranges here. But aid and absorptive capacity, there is a level beyond which absorbing assistance becomes very difficult in any country. And so looking at GDP, looking at that literature in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and trying to identify the appropriate range that beyond which more money is simply, more assistance is simply flooding the zone. And much of that money would simply fuel corruption or be wasted, even if there's no corruption. So I think that is certainly a minimalist way of approaching that question at a bare minimum. But I do think that there's other ways of doing that as well.
Well, and further, almost a follow-up question, how was the planning done? Did you have any general master plan, or were there annual plans or other short-term plans? We understand there is the optimistic scenario and the realistic. Everyone is aiming to end the war as soon as possible, and you can't probably admit that it might take much, much longer. But was there a master plan in Afghanistan?
There were always strategies at every point. It's an interesting dynamic where at every point during the war, there were strategies guiding U.S. efforts. The problem is that many times those strategies, both at the sort of operational level and at the agency level, is that people who were implementing them didn't see the connectivity between what they were doing and how to achieve those larger effects. So there were strategies, people were pursuing them, but they were also politically filtered, as you can imagine, based on the appetites of the people who were reading them. One example is that about 6 months into the mission, in early 2002, USAID predicted that it would cost $2 billion, I think, if I'm remembering correct, $2 billion to rebuild Afghanistan. As SIGAR has demonstrated, we ended up spending 145, almost 150 billion. So the question is, did USAID in that particular instance get it wrong and wildly misestimate how much it would cost to rebuild Afghanistan? It's possible. It's possible. Honestly, I think the more likely scenario is they knew their audience. The Bush administration in early 2002 was not interested in rebuilding Afghanistan beyond simply keeping Al-Qaeda destroyed or on its back foot and making sure that the Taliban couldn't return to power in Afghanistan. That was the mission. And therefore, USAID knows and understands that when they put forward those strategies, that there would be no appetite for that more realistic assessment, as you had just described, Evgenia. And so there were plans in Afghanistan. They were put forward. They were used. They were often short, as I described, very difficult, face significant challenges on the mechanics of the reconstruction, right? There was this idea that we knew what we wanted the end state to look like. We knew that we needed more resources to get there, but there was very little analytical ability to judge how step by step are we going to get there. Those theories have changed. And part of the reason we have concluded is that the U.S. government, speaking only for the U.S. government in Afghanistan, doesn't really prepare for these kinds of missions. We do not invest, certainly in our civilian institutions at state and USAID, into readying ourselves for these kinds of large-scale operations because we continually tell ourselves we won't be doing this again, and therefore we don't need to prepare for it. This isn't super relevant for Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian officials because you don't have a choice. You are in it. You are dealing with this mess. And so it's much more a problem from a donor's perspective of we aren't well equipped to help you because we aren't investing in ourselves so that we can be better and more helpful for you and lay out and develop plans that are more thoughtful and careful and frankly successful.
Mm-hmm. And if I may just add one thing on to David's great points, is one thing that I think we've learned the hard way over the last 20 years is, having strategies and plans is wonderful, but David hinted at this, you have to be able to link the effects of the individual reconstruction efforts to the larger plan. And that's one thing the U.S. was not good at doing in Afghanistan. And I think that's something to take to heart as projects are selected for reconstruction in the Ukraine and projects for assistance are selected. It's important to say, tie the goals of the project to the higher goals of the strategy and really be able to build out the linkages of how each project and the outputs of that project build towards the larger outcome that you're looking for.
I think there is one question from Yuri.
Yes, in fact, there are a lot of questions I would like to raise and ask, but we have some limitation. So one very particular question about the procurement. As you mentioned, $123 billion were spent overall on the reconstruction efforts. I would like to ask you about the procedures which were used when you held your procurement. Did you use donor procurements or development banks procedure procurements, or it was your own? So for us, it's extremely important because, as Valeria mentioned, in Ukraine, we have Prozoro procurement system, and which, based on the principle, everyone sees everything, which is extremely important in the reconstruction as well. And the World Bank also outlined the Prozoro procurement system as the system which we'll use for the procurements which were held by the finances of the World Bank. So could you please share with us your experience about the procurement procedures? Thank you.
Yes, I think one thing that didn't work so well in Afghanistan was we used a whole variety of procurement procedures. Obviously, the U.S. did direct assistance, but even within there, each agency had their own processes and procedures. What state would do to select a project or to select an implementer or to procure something wasn't the same as what USAID would do, and wasn't the same as what the Department of Defense would do. Also, even within each organization, there were 6 or 7 or 8 different methods of applying procurements and of actually purchasing goods and services. And that's just within the U.S. Separately, there were, international trust funds. You had the World Bank, you have various UN organizations, and then you had things like the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which had donations coming from lots of different countries. And each one of those processes had their own procurement rules. And I think all of those, having so many different ways to buy things or reward programs, really muddied the water a lot and actually opened up avenues for corruption. I think being able to have a firm grasp on how projects and programs are awarded, how things are purchased, and making sure that that's very transparent and clear to folks is certainly an important thing to do to reduce opportunities for corruption and to reduce bad actors. That said, obviously, in any reconstruction effort, especially in wartime, there are times when you have to spend money quickly, and obviously you need to balance, spending money quickly and with being able to help folks, because folks need food, water, clothes, jobs, things like that, bridges, ways to get around. So being able to help folks quickly needs to be balanced against the oversight of being able to help folks quickly to make sure the money's going to folks who can actually provide that assistance. It really is a balance between the two, but I think, like you said, transparency is a great thing, and being able to make sure everybody understands how these things are purchased should help cut down on opportunities for corruption.
Yuri, having the opportunity, please ask another question.
Yes, I'm using this monopoly right to be a co-organizer. So one more question about the prioritization, did you use any methodology of prioritization, especially when we're talking about the physical reconstruction of particular objects like schools, kindergartens, or something else? So what approach did you use when you prioritized this? It also will be very useful for us because in Ukraine there are ongoing, as Valeria actually mentioned, about this discussions. Thank you.
Sure. What often happened in Afghanistan was that the US military was driving a lot of these decisions. So they would prioritize certain geographies, and then within those geographies, there would be consultations with local communities about what they needed. And oftentimes the program, the effort, the initiative would backfire because of problematic geography, because the Department of Defense was choosing where to program. They may not have been the most safe, and therefore the ability to procure, the ability to monitor and oversee, the ability to implement programs in those areas was extremely limited. So prioritization, there's the way it was supposed to go, and then the way it actually went, in a lot of cases for many of the years of the 20 years. The way best practices would dictate it should have gone is civilian institutions donor civilian institutions work closely with host nation civilian institutions to prioritize geography, and then within that geography, prioritize specific sectors or projects based on what the community is most in need of. So there was no, that what I just described primarily only happened in major urban areas in Afghanistan. And in rural areas, it often took the turn of Department of Defense choosing the geography and therefore dictating and leading on what kinds of projects would take place. We're talking about much smaller projects. So it didn't always, that portion of it did not always go well.
And if I may add one last thing there to David's ones, what we have found over the last 20 years is the two indicators that would make a project a success were, number one, the host government and the beneficiary's desire for the project. If folks want the project, be it a road or a hospital or a school or a jobs training program, it's much more likely to succeed than if it's being forced on by, an outside group. So that was number one, was if folks wanted the project. And number two was the beneficiaries or the host government's ability to maintain that project. If they had, adequate funding to be able to maintain it after it was provided. We've done reports where we found hospitals, obviously the local community wanted a hospital. So in one case, the US went in and built something like a 35-bed, state-of-the-art hospital. Unfortunately, it was a rural community, and they probably had more of a need for, a 3 to 5 bed clinic. So a lot of the facilities went unused, and they didn't have the funding or the ability to maintain it. And in short order, a lot of it was found in disuse. So it's the two things. Number one, obviously the host government and the beneficiary's desire for the project. If they want it, if there's buy-in, it's going to work. And then number two, their ability to fund it and sustain it after it's been provided.
Thank you. And a question from our listeners again. What measures to eliminate corruption in government institutions in Afghanistan, except decreasing the amount of financial aid, were used, and were they effective in the short or long-term perspective?
Sure. I'll give a couple of examples. There were, at multiple points, high-level investigative and prosecutorial efforts whereby U.S. officials would work side by side with Afghan officials to prosecute high-level crimes and to pursue them, and with the Attorney General's office and whatnot. And on at least two separate occasions, what happened is that the capabilities of this office were quite extraordinary. The crimes that were able to be mapped out were very impressive. And when these officials would be arrested or indicted, there would be high-level political interventions from allies within the rest of the government that essentially said these people need to be protected and they cannot go to jail because they are a critical part of the government, and that there were attempts to try and discredit the process politically, that it is essentially sort of like a witch hunt. And those interventions were ultimately successful. Those individuals were released from prison or from jail. They were not fully prosecuted. And the model of what anti-corruption investigations could look like had been very strong, but if there was no ability to actually follow through on it because of these high-level political interventions, the model was flipped on its head and basically collapsed. And so these offices went away. This investigative capacity was determined to be too great a threat to the stability of the government, because once you start peeling that onion, who knows where it takes you, right? And that's exactly what happened on multiple occasions in Afghanistan. Around the time of President Obama's surge in 2009 and 10 was when, as I mentioned earlier, corruption was really recognized as something that couldn't be just, dealt with a little bit here and a little bit there. It needed to be addressed head on with by addressing government impunity and senior level officials being prosecuted and indicted. And there was an inability to follow through on it, which in turn, of course, gave rise to greater impunity during the second decade of the war, and a sense that there was really nothing that could be done at a large scale about corruption. So the short answer to the question is there were high-level prosecutions attempted. They ultimately did not succeed, and it actually made disillusioned Afghans even more than before those efforts had been mounted.
And sort of the flip side of that coin, one effort that did meet some success was efforts to protect some reformers and some good actors within ministries. These folks that we were able to protect largely were not the political appointees at the high levels. They weren't necessarily the ministers or the deputy ministers or people like that, but there were concerted efforts over the years to provide salary support and other efforts to mid-level technocrats, mid-level bureaucrats who are identified as being good actors and non-corrupt. And there were efforts made to protect them, because it takes time to, move from remove, if an institution has been captured by corruption, it takes a good deal of time to, make that institution clean again. So being able to protect good actors, be it from, outside, using either outside support, and from a high level, or being something as simple as salary support. So that way you can afford to retain the good actors, was something that was met with a modicum of success at the mid and lower levels of the Afghan government.
And a follow-up question on the prosecutions issue.
Sorry, colleagues, I have to go. If you have any questions for me, I really thank for this conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for participating and spending the time with us. The question, the criminal responsibility, was it according to the US legislation or Afghan legislation?
These were crimes in Afghanistan. So these were Afghan crimes being pursued with technical support of US investigators and officials.
And a question about your reporting. Which standards of audit did you use?
Yes, we follow it's informally known as the GAO Yellow Book. It's the SIGI standards. It's the standards for, I'm actually forgetting what the acronym stands for right now, but it's the GAO Yellow Book. So it lays out in pretty good detail, what exact standards you need to follow, from, sufficiency of evidence to how you report it, to giving the auditee a chance to respond. So, the U.S. Government Accountability Office has long been the gold standard of U.S. oversight organizations, and they create and disseminate, whole rule books for audits and evaluations, to inspections, to other products such as our lessons learned reports and our quarterly reports all follow the rules and regulations laid out by the Government Accountability Office through, again, informally it's called the Yellow Book for audits and inspections, and then the Blue Book is used for other type products, such as evaluations and our quarterly report and the lessons learned report. but they lay out in great detail, all the steps of the audit process or the report process, how you start it, how you conduct your field work, who you report to, how it's properly reviewed, all the way to how the work papers are properly stored. So that way they're available for the future folks who want to come back and double check your work or recreate your work in a future time.
Could you please tell more about the department and the director of research and analysis? What were their tasks? Why was this position created? Were they some post-analysis or, on the contrary, forecasts, alternative solutions? Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'll quickly go over what research and analysis is, and then I'll let David go through what the lessons learned group is, because I think they're very unique and valuable. Our research and analysis directorate is in charge of producing our quarterly report. We are tasked with Congress to report to them every 90 days on the status of U.S. efforts to assist the people of Afghanistan. And the research and analysis group is tasked with creating this project. So they send out, a whole list of questions every 90 days to both U.S. organizations, international organizations, NGOs, folks on the ground, to be able to get the ground truth and compile that into a reporting back to them. And that the quarterly report has really become an almanac of U.S. reconstruction efforts since 2008 when we started. You can go and you can look and see what programs were ongoing, how much money we were spending, what was successful, what wasn't, what challenges we were facing. And having, a record, a guidepost every 90 days, I think we just published our 60th quarterly report. So having 60 of these documents to be able to go back and look, you can really trace the U.S. effort in Afghanistan by reading these things, because each one is a really good snapshot of the point in time of where we were, what we were thinking, where we thought things were going. And with that, I'll turn it over to David to explain a bit about our lessons learned directorate, because they do a lot of very interesting and valuable work.
Sure. So while our quarterly reports are looking at contemporary information, sort of the latest report card to come out of the last 90 days, we zoom out a bit more. We look at, so there might be a program that Chris's team is doing an audit or evaluation on, that the content and substance of that might be also reported in the quarterly report, where they're discussing the latest information to come out of Afghanistan on a specific program, how much money was spent on that program this quarter. And a lessons learned program, we zoom out a bit more and try and answer the question, so what? Regarding U.S. assistance on a particular sector, so counter-narcotics or private sector development, and try and trace the broader understanding of what are the premise of all of these programs when you take them all together in their totality. What is the strategy that is guiding all of these programs to implementation, and what was the impact ultimately? And so we conduct interviews with so far we've done over 1,000 interviews with many with U.S. officials, Afghans on the ground, beneficiaries to programs, to try and answer the question, what did it all mean? What was it all for on a specific, usually a specific sector of assistance?
Thank you very much. And one more question, and I think then maybe just the last, and then we will wrap up. So on the one hand, ownership of the recovery policy from the central government makes these efforts more effective and controlled. On the other hand, it's not that inclusive in this way. In Ukraine, we are a pretty much decentralized country, and local governments play a crucial role. It's very important to strike the balance between centralization and decentralization. Do you have any lessons learned on this in case of Afghanistan?
Yes. I think that first, I think it's really important to note that the level of ownership in the Afghan government pales in comparison to what donors have described to us that they are seeing in Ukraine. And for obvious reasons, comparing Ukraine and Afghanistan in many cases is an absurdity to compare them in many cases, especially as it relates to ownership of programs and recovery efforts. What we saw in Afghanistan was challenged. So as you went further from the central government, that sense of ownership often faded among government officials. So there were many cases where Afghan government would try and U.S. government would try and push out programs to the provinces and even down to the district level, and really struggle for those officials to take ownership over those programs. There would be there was very little incentive because of the way that the Afghan government was highly centralized. There was very little incentive for local government officials to be accountable to their constituents in their local communities. Instead, there was upward accountability back to Kabul. So all they had to do structurally, functionally, was keep their bosses happy in Kabul. They didn't have to keep their constituents happy through effective program implementation, through accountable service delivery. None of that mattered when it came, because of the way that the Afghan government was structured. So while from a program sort of capturing the strategic insights of a program is much harder to do in a decentralized country because of accountability and understanding of what is taking place. In terms of the delivery of those programs at the local level in partnership with local government officials, it's far better for the accountability to be more distributed among so that there's downward accountability to constituents themselves.
And the probably very last question, because we are almost running out of time, is did you use any digital solutions? And if yes, for what aims? Because in Ukraine, maybe, we are actually a pretty good digitally developed country.
Yes, we used a variety of digital tools. Again, like you just said, Ukraine has so many more digital assets than Afghanistan did. One problem we would regularly run into, is you'd have to rely on paper records if they existed at all, because there may not be power or internet, at the distributed sites out in the field. So being able to keep track of simple things like border records or customs duties, or the number of teachers at a school on a given day, was all reliant on paper records that you'd have to go there to get, because they didn't have the digital infrastructure that Ukraine has. I think that's a major benefit of both the oversight of the reconstruction and the construction of Ukraine, as well as actually performing the work, is your digital architecture and being able to collect information in real time from a whole variety of sources, be they databases or web-based, and really be able to get the ground truth that way. And, I think that's going to be a great benefit as you continue the oversight, just being able to gather the data right away as it's input into the systems, and be able to monitor things in real time, be it via the web, via video cameras or whatever else, that because you have this digital architecture you're able to use that wasn't available in Afghanistan.
And one word of caution to add on that is that in Afghanistan, there was sort of also a heavy romanticization of technology in multiple cases. I was thinking specifically about elections and voting. There was a sense as the elections unfolded that the silver bullet was increasing use of technology to address fraud during elections. And so while digitization and technology is extremely useful for creating the sort of the backbone of a monitoring framework for implementing projects and whatnot, there is a risk that both partners and donors could think that if it is happening through technology, it is therefore happening with greater integrity. And what we saw in Afghanistan is, while the baselines were completely different, the introduction of technology to fix or address a problem was often not enough to change the level of integrity, that technology is no substitute for integrity and it's no guarantee of it. But and so that is certainly something we learned in Afghanistan, particularly in the last 5 years when President Ghani was leading the country, or the last 7 years when President Ghani was in the country, and having a very technocratic background, he emphasized heavily the importance of introducing modern technology to solve many of these reconstruction challenges. And what we saw is that while helpful conceptually, while helpful in theory, there was often significant blowback if the integrity of the institutions didn't change. It simply meant that someone was fraudulently pushing a button on a computer over and over again, instead of fraudulently writing an answer into a ledger over and over again.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here because the time of the session has ended. But as you understand, there are still lots of questions there. I want to thank you, to say a great thank you to you for spending the time and sharing the lessons and getting into the nitty details of this 20-year experience of the US forces in Afghanistan. It was, I think, without exaggeration, extremely helpful and insightful. And thank you again very much for spending the time. And I think we gained a lot of valuable information, and I hope that the civil society of Ukraine, together with the government, will be able to implement it fully or partly, and to draw the lessons and to make our reconstruction and recovery after we win this war effective. Thank you very much. As we say in Ukraine, дякую. And if you don't mind, we will share your presentation with our participants via email. On this note, have a nice Friday. I wish all Ukrainian listeners a quiet and peaceful weekend, and see you at the next exchange session that our institute will be holding in 2024. Goodbye.
Thank you.